Hello and welcome to the Church Society podcast. I'm Ros Clark, I'm the Associate Director of Church Society and I'm your host here on these podcasts. This week I am joined by George Crowder, one of our regional directors, and by Phil Hobbs. Phil, just tell us who you are and what you do in life.
Thanks, Ros. I'm Phil and I'm a final year law student who's finishing in theory this week at Sheffield University and I'm engaged to Beth, due to be married this Saturday.
Due to be married this Saturday. I mean, that is quite exciting. We're going to come on to that in just a moment. Just to let you know, this episode, we're going to be talking about a number of different things to consider as we are moving slowly out of the period of lockdown. So we're going to be talking about marriage and the impact that lockdown has had on that. We're going to be thinking about the government and its priorities as it is easing lockdown, people and profits, business or household. And we're also going to just be thinking a bit about where churches are at, how things have changed given the guidance in the last few weeks, what we hope might be coming next, and what kind of questions we need to be thinking about. And as always, I'll be asking everyone to share some recommendations with us. So, Phil, you were due to be getting married this Saturday. Presumably you are now not getting married this Saturday.
Yeah, that's right. We've planned to have a barbecue with Beth's family outside in a gazebo instead.
I mean, I'm sure that will, more or less make up for everything. At what point, given everything that's been happening, at what point did you realise that wasn't going to go ahead as you'd originally planned?
I think probably a week ago was the day we realised, when the government had said by the 1st of June they'd update people on small weddings. So I guess last week when that didn't happen on the 1st of June, I think we both just felt really disappointed, sort of had worked up imagining that the government had said the 1st of June will let you know, probably they're going to say yes. So I think it was really disappointing about this time last week when we realised that it probably wasn't going to go ahead.
And presumably before that you'd had to cancel plans for, I don't know, presumably you'd initially invited more than 2 people or whatever. You'd had to cancel sort of reception and all of those kind of things, but you'd still thought there might be a chance that you could actually get married.
Yeah, my parents had really kindly said Beth's parents could be the 2 witnesses. So we'd rearranged a reception sort of as a 1-year anniversary party next summer, hoping that maybe grandparents and vulnerable friends could be allowed to come as well by then. So that's what we planned for next year instead, I guess, for a reception.
Okay, so it's been a difficult thing, hasn't it? Obviously, most church services have not been permitted. There has been an exception for funerals all the way through, although with quite strict guidelines on who's allowed to attend. And I've had some.
It's not been possible to have funerals in a church building. It's
no.
only around the graveside or in a crematorium.
Yes, and I've heard different stories about rules about whether you can sing at those or not, and some are permitting it or not, and quite limited numbers of guests as well. So it has been very restricted, and obviously there's an urgency about a funeral that you can see why they felt they needed to make that exception. Why were you hoping? I mean, I know they sort of mentioned that they might do it. Why do we think it might have been a good thing for them to have extended that exception? Because that's really all we were hoping for, I guess, was a similar sort of situation where you'd have the minister and the couple and maybe 2 or 3 guests, still restricted numbers, limited kind of service. What sort of priority would that have communicated if the government had said, yeah, actually that can start going ahead at this point?
Well, I think it's something that particularly matters to Christians because it's something that particularly affects us with cohabiting before marriage is obviously really common in society. And so probably from a government's point of view, it's really low on the agenda, thinking we need to get people who maybe are really used to seeing each other and preparing to live together back together. But for Christians, I guess there's that element of wanting to be pure sexually and so not cohabiting and not together already. And I think that's where it's not just something that people like me want so that we can live together and maybe have sex or whatever, but it's sort of an ontological change we want as well, something we can be married and have that sort of mutual comfort and support that the Book of Common Prayer talks about marriage being for one another, both in hard times, obviously right now, really difficult times with doubt and uncertainty, and in good times. And that's what we want, and what others like us want is in a sense, we want our best friend back. And I think that's what's really important. It's the marriage as a building block for life, and as an actual change in situation for people that at the moment is torn away and it's really hard. I think, yeah,
I think that's right, isn't it? It's so different from the situation of the couple who are already living together. Maybe they already have children together, and effectively what their marriage is doing. It's not that it's not important to them, but it is basically just a big celebration and a party. And in other ways, their life doesn't change massively as a result of it. I mean, there are legal changes and stuff that matter, but deferring that for a while is not such a big thing. Can you just tell us a bit, Phil, about sort of practically the fact that you're not going to be able to get married when you'd originally planned? What impact is that going to have? Presumably you've been planning to move in together after this and now you're not. How is that going to work?
Yeah, that's one complication. You're right. Beth at the moment has been living in a rented house. That's her contract expiring at the end of June, and new tenants are going to be moving in. Her parents live in Leeds and we're in Sheffield, so she won't move to her parents. She's going to move in with some friends of hers in Sheffield, because we won't move into this house where I am now together. It's in a village a bit outside Sheffield, where we're actually going on a church craft due to start this month. A place called Outerbridge. So it's a bit isolated maybe from our current support networks and friends, and that's why she doesn't really want to move here and live here alone.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I'm going to hope that when she moves in, she'll bring some nice artwork and curtains. For those who are listening on audio, Phil's in a very stark white room that he's sitting in at the moment. It is really difficult. I think one of the things I wonder that just has maybe made that feel a little bit more painful even is that we have seen some quite high profile stories of couples that have been permitted to get married in exceptional circumstances. And obviously we don't always know what has made those circumstances exceptional, but there was all over the papers a couple who'd been able to get married in a hospital chapel. They both worked, I think, at the hospital, or certainly for the NHS, and the Archbishop had given permission for that. And that is, I think, how people have been able to get married. If there's exceptional circumstances, you can apply for an Archbishop's license, a special license, if he thinks that's appropriate. So, there was somebody on the Jake Facebook group last week who was taking a wedding where I think it was the bridegroom has a terminal illness, and obviously there was a real sense of urgency, and they'd been granted special permission for that, which, I don't think anyone can argue with that, but it does make it particularly hard if you're seeing that you're not being granted that. George, the Church of England have come out, I think, with some guidelines, not permitting weddings to go forward now, but giving us an idea of what they might look like when they are allowed. Just what are we expecting to happen?
We get a Dawson briefing every week, and in this week's briefing, which just arrived this morning, was some of the guidelines they are saying they are planning, although the government hasn't given permission to do that yet. I think it's the Church of England trying to be on the front foot, and certainly they've gone. I'm sorry about that. I should have put that in the room. To be on the front foot, and they are actively campaigning to move this forward, which is really positive. I'm so sorry.
There's obviously a very urgent pastoral request. Trying to be on the front foot. That's good. Yeah.
Well, yes, and that is encouraging. So there are guidelines for opening up churches for individuals to come and pray on their own. There are guidelines for funerals and for small weddings and for baptisms. And they're all along the similar sort of line. A lot of emphasis on giving good visual cues, of marshalling people and having a very small number there. very specific guidelines. And, there's no need to touch the ring, and there's everyone except the couple has to be kind of socially distanced, and there's no need to touch their hands. I mean, in a marriage, I would often hold the hands of both the bride and the groom. And in baptism, you were to use at the distance a receptacle to pour it. So
to pour the water. I love that. Get your hose pipe.
And you're not allowed to hold the child either. The parents have to offer the child, and then you pour the water.
Wow.
So they've really tried to think through. They haven't given specific numbers because there's no numbers being given by the government. They've just said a small number, and there's very much emphasis on this will be a local decision. And I think that PCCs, and I've written about this on the blog, need to be kind of thinking this way as well, getting on the front foot and thinking through the sort of things that they might now have to put in place. Around it for the church buildings they have.
Yeah, and what normal practices are. So, some churches and some vicars will have different sort of normal traditions about how they do a baptism or how they perform a marriage, and we'll need to think about those individually. Well, let's hope it moves forward. Phil, just tell us, you've been actively also trying to encourage things to move forward. There's a petition, I believe, isn't there? Can people still sign that?
Yeah, I think so. It's over 10,000 signatures now, so it will be given to government, but it's still going. It's only about 5 days now, I think, and it's about on at least 13,000 anyway. But that's still available to be signed. A group of people in a situation like me have written to the Archbishop of Canterbury and York and all our diocesan bishops as well. A group of maybe 30 of us. We've had the Archbishop replied and copied in all the other diocesan bishops, and they've all said, "See Archbishop Justin's reply. Our prayers are with you," this sort of thing. And he's sort of saying, "Thank you for reminding us of just how difficult it must be for you, and we will be with renewed enthusiasm praying for you and speaking for you in the situation." So I guess there's that petition to sign.
I'll put a link to that in the blog post that goes with this. And I guess, for all the reasons that we said, it's unlikely that that's going to sort of open an avalanche of people want to get married. If you're not Christian and what you really want is all your family and friends there in your big party, that's not going to happen this summer anyway. So it's likely to be only relatively small numbers of people in your sort of situation, Phil, that will say, no, we actually just want to get married and we don't really worry about all the rest of it. I think just thinking about more broadly how the government have been making decisions about lockdown and priorities for easing lockdown. I mean, it does seem to me that they are most concerned with the economic impacts, most concerned, let's say, with the health impacts of coronavirus. But after that, the sort of economic impacts, and those are pretty significant. When lockdown was first announced, they were talking about 3 weeks, and then we would review the situation. And we are now almost at 3 months, not quite, but almost at 3 months. And obviously that's had a huge impact on many businesses and the economy more broadly. But it's also had, therefore, a greater impact on people than we initially thought. 3 weeks is sort of a long holiday. And, you can put up with a lot of things for 3 weeks, but 3 months feels very different. As lockdown guidance has changed, we've been able to meet up with one person or then with 6 people. How has that affected what you have been able to do? George, you have 6 people already in your household, don't you? I mean, have the easing of the guidance made any difference to your life and the sort of quality of life and relationships of people in your house and in your community?
No, not as yet, but we can't meet as a family with anybody else, and then we have to start selecting who might. So not really. The children have had various possibilities of going back to school, slowly getting concretized, but mainly that's digital. It's just that the teachers are going into the classrooms and then doing some Zoom seminars from the classrooms.
Yeah.
Just on the point the importance of where people are at and how people are coping and easing back. It's very interesting that as schools go back, their priority is not curriculum, it's welfare. They're not hoping to hit any targets and get anything done. They're just trying to get the kids have something where they see each other and have some sense of normality. And so when I spoke to the head teacher about assemblies, it's quite high on the priority list, having that kind of input, because it helps with welfare and emotional kind of uplift is really important.
Yeah, that's great.
This economic sort of priority is not the main thing. People are struggling, people are not uncertain. And when we look at children, they're an excellent case in point. The most important thing is people's kind of social, spiritual welfare.
Yeah.
And so churches have a really important role to play. And I think we need to have that message that it's a really important part of community life that can be a massive help at this situation.
I agree. I thought it was really interesting at the point, they sort of announced that you could meet up with one other person. And then the sort of next big announcement was shops are going to be able to open. All kinds of shops are going to be able to open. And you just think, it just seemed to me to completely miss the mood, which, there are some people who are desperate to get back shopping, I'm sure. But there's a lot of people who are kind of, I really want to be able to go and see my mum and sit in her garden. Or, Phil, I don't know how it's been for you and your fiance. Have you been able to see each other at all during this period? I don't know what your sort of current living arrangements are, but whether you're near enough to go and sort of have a distanced walk in the park or anything.
Yeah, particularly at the beginning, I guess, when it was sort of, it'd been 2 months when we hadn't seen each other, except for me dropping food off to her door when her and her household were isolating. At that point, it really was important for us to going on a walk together, that sort of thing. And so now we sometimes go on cycle rides or walks together. I think you're right. The relating to one another is so significant, and something that I guess is still difficult. And maybe when Beth's having a hard time and finding it all a bit overwhelming, there's still something really missing in our interaction with maybe not being able to comfort her physically when she's finding things tough. But I think you're right. That's been something that should be higher on the agenda, the relating to one another aspect of life, as opposed to the plural shopping opportunities.
I know. I just saw today they're thinking about removing all restrictions on Sunday trading. Nobody needs that. Nobody needs to be shopping 24/7, and we're not going to have more money to spend. It's not going to have anyway. It just felt all wrong to me in terms of what people really want. And I think one of the things I also wonder is, it just seems to me, maybe it's not an awareness, maybe it's just that they do need to do the broad brushstrokes, but the sort of attention doesn't seem to have been given to people who don't fit within a sort of stereotypical situation. So your example of marriage is a really good one there. Your situation isn't quite what most people who are planning to get married this summer would have been, and therefore it's overlooked. But I think with the sort of meeting up thing as well, the people in larger households, how little difference that's made, but also the people like me, I live on my own. So what that means is it's nearly 3 months since I had any physical contact with any other human being at all. That's a really long time for people to go without anyone to give them a hug or, kiss on the cheek or shake the hand even. It just really hit me last week. This isn't a really good way to live. And a lot of people, I think, will probably have noticed that quite a lot sooner than I did. But I would have loved to see them just give more attention to how this is affecting people and people's lives, not just worrying about the sort of financial implications of everything. And it seems to me to show what the government really thinks matters, which I'm not sure is what we think really matters. Well, let's move on just to think about how all of this is affecting churches. So, George, I can't remember. I think we might have talked about this on the podcast before. But just remind us, what has your church been doing for the last few months by way of gathering together?
We're quite a small congregation, so meeting together on Zoom is the most viable thing for us. We can interact quite well. Our services were very interactive anyway, because we're small, so people could interrupt at any point. And that was a nice thing. We liked that. And so, although some of our members have had a long learning curve with Zoom and they've still not quite got it, and there's lots of kind of strange noises. So you have to mute all. I do have quite a regular slot in the service where I unmute everybody and give them the chance to say something, usually partway through the talk, and certainly at two other parts of the service. I think that's really, really good. We spent the first 2 weeks doing Zoom tutorials for older people. But it was worth it, because I mean, anybody can get on it. So we prioritize fellowship, and production value has taken a hit, but our production value was never that good. So it's okay.
Yeah, exactly. It's being authentic, isn't it? You don't have to be whizzy online if you were never whizzy in person. Phil, just give us an idea. You're at a much bigger church, I think, in Sheffield. Tell us what your church has been doing.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a member at Christ Church Forward, which is quite a well-known, large church, maybe about 900 adults on a Sunday. And what they're doing sounds quite different to you, George. We have a YouTube pre-recorded service that goes live at 10:30 on a Sunday morning, where one of the staff team will be leading and preaching, and they'll have a family or a household doing the music. A few different families with their kids and all their middle-class music lessons that they've had are coming very, very good at the moment. So that's been, I guess, the main thing at Christ Church Forward's been the Sunday morning services. We've been encouraged to keep meeting in small groups. Mine's on a Wednesday evening, and they've been producing fairly regular vlogs as well online, discussing topical issues, one about VE Day, one on the elephant in the Zoom, and sort of what was it about? You can see I probably don't suffer from it. It was talking about what you sort of seek to present on Zoom, and who you're trying to be, that sort of idea, and maybe presenting yourself to be really on top of things and have a really nicely presented house. Clearly I'm not.
So for those of you who are listening on audio, George is presenting the picture of himself as a keen reader with stuffed bookshelves and a carefully positioned cross. Phil is presenting himself as an ultra minimalist white wall chic, and I am presenting myself as a on-brand associate director of Church Society. So yeah, very good. Good. So things have changed a little bit, as we said, in terms of guidelines. So 6 people are now permitted to meet with each other. You don't all have to be from the same household, at a distance, outside. We didn't really have the weather this weekend for doing much outdoors. But George, how might churches and ministers be starting to think about using some of that extra freedom that we now have?
I think that there are 2 things to think about, aren't there? There is, how do we do what we normally do in a new way? Because we're thinking about how we do church safely. We've got to keep planning for that. It's not there yet. But we're trying to sort of change slightly, or as little as possible, the things that we want to do. But there's another thing that we want to do is, what can we do with the freedoms we've been given? Which is, we can now meet with 6 people outside. And can we do anything with that? And I think that's what we should do. And so I'm going to talk to the PCC tonight on our next little phase meeting about having a meeting of 5 people with me in the back garden under a large gazebo with carefully spaced chairs. And what we can do with that. We did have a ministry called Tea at 2, which was for people who kind of in the house a lot. And they would get brought round to my house, and I give them tea and cakes and talk to them, and somehow I'd read the Bible, and then we'd start talking about So I thought that would be the last ministry to restart. It looks like it's going to be the first.
Yeah.
So, but I think we've just got to take advantage of the things we get. Pastoral visits in the garden, I suspect, have been quietly happening.
So no, it's hard to tell, isn't it, whether you're just on your daily exercise happening to walk past somebody's front door, or whether that's a permitted visit in the garden. But
I know several, in fact, members of our church family who looked at maps and worked out where everybody lived and somehow planned their daily walk to go past them.
Brilliant. Well, that, why not? Absolutely. So it is tricky, isn't it? Think about how we can use what we've got now for those sort of small groups, informal visits. One thing I've been trying to encourage people to think about is garden church. So that might be just simply getting 6 people together to sit in your garden and watch whatever online service there is, but do that together. Or it could be, in some churches, it might be appropriate to put together a little sort of garden church kit that includes, here's what the Bible reading will be, here's a sermon that you could read out or that you could play, here's some songs that you could sing together, somebody within your 6 can lead some prayers, here's some liturgy, and actually be doing church in those little tiny groups. Obviously, as we go forward, we hope that things will ease further. We might be able to get some bigger groups meeting together. I've heard people talking about drive-through church or drive-in church, which, if you've got a big car park and a big screen, could be a way forward as well. Harder, I think, in a big church, perhaps. I mean, in sort of little churches, you can imagine. Phil, what would you love to see as things go forward, your church, as they begin to think about bringing back together? 900 people in a building seems impossible, doesn't it? What sort of next steps might they think about?
Yeah, I guess I don't really know so much of that. I guess that's the thing with such a large church, that a lot of the initiatives aren't necessarily centrally run, but centrally, I guess, motivated or a vision for them given. And so a lot of the pastoral visiting and that sort of thing is kind of left to small group leaders who are lay members, maybe with full-time day jobs anyway. Rather than sort of all the ministers coordinating, or a minister perhaps coordinating every different area. It's sort of, I think, presumes there'll be more self-starting. So I don't quite know what will happen top down. But I hope there'll be, like you're saying, with garden church sort of thing, and people taking the initiative to look out for one another and join together. We've been doing a chat after church in our small group on Zoom, which I guess could develop into perhaps two garden churches at different places. But I don't know what will happen top down.
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Difficult things to think about. I want to just mention George wrote a blog post for us last week on Church Life website, just with half a dozen questions for PCCs and church leaders to be considering as we think about move forward. And they won't all be questions that you can answer yet, and they may be questions that the answer changes as we go along. But just if you're if you're wondering where on earth you start, there's some good pointers there. Well, I'm going to ask for recommendations. I'm going to ask for recommendations from both of you in a moment, but I'm going to start with mine, which are all really following on from last week's podcast. Remember last week we began to talk a bit about the problem of racism, and particularly racism in the UK church. And I just want to mention a couple of things. There's a really great podcast from Speak Life, and it's a great podcast in general. But last week's episode on George Floyd, racism and the UK church, with Jason Roach and Richard Awoyemi, who are both black pastors in London, one in an Anglican church and one not. Really insightful and interesting and important. There's also an article which Jason had written on ethnicity and COVID-19. One of the things that has been very striking about coronavirus has been the disparity in the way that it's impacted people from different ethnic groups. And Jason talks very helpfully about some of the serious underlying reasons why that might be the case. that I think we all need to listen to. And finally, I've not read Ben Lindsay's book, We Need to Talk About Race, Understanding the Black Experience in White Majority Churches. It's on my list. People have been recommending it. But I wanted to let you know that there is going to be an online event next Tuesday. That is the 16th of June at 8 o'clock, which is an interview with Ben Lindsay and a Q&A on that subject of We Need to Talk About Race, Black Experience in White Majority Churches. So those are my recommendations. Phil, what have you been enjoying that you want to recommend to the rest of us?
One thing I mentioned earlier that I found really valuable is the chatting with my small group after a church service. That's been really good for regular interactions with other people and for discussing maybe what we've heard and how our weeks have been and how our lives have been since Wednesday when we had small group. And then a second thing, I've been reading a book called Instruments in the Redeemer's Hand with my one-to-one at church, and we've read a chapter and discussed it most weeks through the lockdown, carrying on what we'd been doing before. That's been really valuable to not just read it and have information overload, but to be asked about what was significant or what might change in how you talk to people this next week. And a third thing I found helpful in this lockdown has been having a project. I've had my final year law essays, and I'm not.
But those are coming to an end, presumably.
Say again.
Those are coming to an end, presumably.
They are tomorrow, and I'm ready to do a bibliography today and submit.
Great.
I'm not suggesting any of you should write an essay on constitutional law or competition law, but maybe just have a project. My sister-in-law's picked up a language and is learning Spanish on an app, and she's finding that quite fun.
Brilliant. Last week, Amanda showed us the blanket that she had crocheted. So yeah, similar thing. And a really good point about reading a book with another person and talking to them about it. You don't need to do that with every book you read, but sometimes it's a really helpful way of actually taking on board what you're reading and thinking about. Great. George?
At the moment, as a church, we're going through a little book called Caring for One Another by Ed Welch, which takes the principles that are in Instruments for the Redeemer's Hand and kind of tries to get the whole congregation along with it. It's very simple, very thin book, and we just kind of pad out a chapter each week. And that's been a good thing, especially in this situation where we are trying to care for one another. So that would be a recommendation. Buy 20 and give them out. And there's a book called Destiny by David Gibson, which it's a commentary on Ecclesiastes, really, but a very reflective philosophical look at the point of life. We might be thinking about that. And now, and something a little different. I'm a big fan of dystopian fiction. Do you like dystopian fiction?
No.
I absolutely love it.
Couldn't tell you what that word means.
Okay. My daughter is too. It's generally aimed at young adults. Young adult sort of dystopian fiction with the Hunger Games. It has been a big thing, and things like Divergence and The Maze Runner. But I want to recommend two series which have got quite a strong Christian apologetic and good conversation starters, especially with young adults. So one is the Time Out series by Nadine Brands, where everybody gets a clock and they know how long they're going to live. And the other one is Anomaly by Krista McGee, and that is probably the best Christian apologetic. Particular character called John, who appears in the sort of second and third book. Good books to read with people and then talk about the themes that come out.
Great, thank you. I won't promise to read them. I don't. I feel like the world is dystopian enough most of the time.
Well, the reason I'm recommending them is because I feel like I'm in a dystopian novel now.
Yeah,
I've read so many
exactly.
of them, and it all ticks every box, and it's strangely cathartic.
Yes, they often begin with a global pandemic, don't they?
There's a big crisis, and then you have to. Then society has to make all these changes, and then they have to live with it.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll put links to all of those. I wanted to let you know, particularly if you're an audio podcast listener, that we are now available on Spotify. They have changed their system, so they're opened up to all kinds of podcasts. I will put a direct link to that, but if you use Spotify and you search for the Church Society podcast, you should be able to find that. I will be back next week with Amanda Robbie and Martin Davey, and we will be talking through the issues of the week. If there's something that comes up over the next 7 days that you think would be interesting to hear about on the Church Society podcast, do drop me a line. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining me this week, and thanks to you for listening and watching.